إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to our seventh and final episode with regards to our history and our journey through the history of Islam in the world. And mashallah, we spoke about Islam in Europe, we spoke about Islam in Africa, in the Americas, in Asia. Now, what remains, what is the last episode about? What do you think? We're going to speak about something that nobody expects, Islam in Oceania, in Australia. Now, yes, indeed, you heard right. There is and there was Islam in Australia and in Oceania, but basically it's not just as many people believe now, especially that the unfortunate incident in New Zealand became news, so that people know that there are some Muslims living in New Zealand and Australia. But Muslims had actually already been in Australia as they had been in the Americas long before the Europeans had arrived. Now, it's a massive fact again. It's something new we learn again, and we see Muslims had been in Australia long before Captain Cook arrived in Australia. Now, interestingly enough, we all know now Australia, we all know Oceania simply because the British went there, the Europeans went there, and they so-called discovered these countries for us. Nevertheless, this part of the world, that part of the world we're talking about, the Oceania, was not unknown to Muslims from Indonesia. If we look at Indonesia and if we look at the closeness, the location of Australia, we see, and Oceania, we see that Indonesia and Indonesian archipelagos and the Indonesian islands are closer to Australia than any other part of the world. And it was natural to develop a kind of trade relationship. And in the northern territories of Australia, indeed, this video is sponsored by the 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗡 program. For nearly 7 centuries, Ibn Khaldoun's 𝗘𝗦𝗟𝗡 has been read and studied by scholars and students of history, sociology, politics and economics as the single most authoritative and astounding work of classical scholarship in the field of history. Embark on an enlightening educational venture led by Muslim scholars and teachers delving into Islamic history, sociology, economics and beyond. Engage with cutting-edge learning cues and multimedia components, allowing for a deeper understanding of the topics. Distinguish between the lies and the truths of the narratives told, between reliable and unreliable sources. Equip yourself with the skills to conduct deep research and build confidence to combat Islamophobia. Come and strengthen your Muslim identity today. Grab the course in the video description. The Northern Territories with the capital Darwin. There was a trade relationship, there was a special relationship between Australian people, indigenous Aborigines, indigenous people in Australia, and Muslims from Indonesia. Now, natural, I find it, because look how close it is. If you look at the map, you'll see how close these two countries are, these two peoples are. And of course, many Aborigines accepted Islam. And of course, many Indonesians who went to trade and to settle maybe even in certain villages in the northern territories of Australia, many of them married Aboriginal women and had families. And in the end, we are told, there are sources that talk about entire Muslim villages in the Northern Territories in Australia long before the British arrived. Muslim villages in Australia. There is nowadays a museum, an Islamic museum in Australia that you can go and visit. Hopefully I will have the chance to go and visit it also once, inshallah, that tells you about the history of Islam in Australia. And it didn't start after the British had come, and it didn't start in the 1900s or in the 20th or 21st century. It started long before. And first of them were the Indonesians, Muslims from Indonesia, who were doing trade with the indigenous people of Northern Australia. These Indonesian traders influenced the language, the culture and the religion, of course, of these indigenous Australians. As we said, they were Muslim villages. Some of the words that are used in certain Aboriginal languages, especially in the north, have some element, Arabic Indonesian element as well, which indicates that Islam played a role and was a dominant religion, and it had become the main religion, the dominant religion actually in the north of Australia. The Indonesian traders from Sulawesi, which was known formerly Celebes, visited the coast of northern Australia for hundreds of years prior to the arrival of the British in Australia to fish for 𝗘𝗔𝗥𝗡. 𝗘𝗔𝗥 is also known as sea cucumber or sandfish. Now, so the Indonesian Muslims, the Muslims of Indonesia, had an interest in the sea cucumber, and this resulted into a link between the descendants of the Indonesian traders and the Aboriginal Australians. Interestingly enough, I could find out that between 1500 and 1600, Muslims paid to use land in Australia. So in order to be there and Muslims to do what they were doing, basically to do their trade, they even paid Aborigines to use their land. This is unheard of. Can you imagine a European, a British or a French or a German or whoever, European arriving in Aborigine land or in Africa or whatever, and even paying them to use their land and even treating them with respect? This is something that we have not come across, and we have seen in all the episodes that most of the time it's not Europeans who treated the subjects properly. Early fleets of settlers used Muslims from Africa and the islands and territories under the British Empire for labor and as navigators, because there is evidence that African Muslims from West Africa had sailed to the Americas and to other parts of the world, as we mentioned before. Because of the knowledge that Muslim Africans, especially from Mali, had, many of the early settlers used them, Muslims, to take them to certain territories such as Australia as well. There's no evidence, 100% evidence for that, but it is very clear due to the fact that we have seen that, for example, in the past and in other parts of the world, this has happened. We can assume that the same happened also in Australia. Interestingly enough, I was explained by one Australian once, certain words, around 250, are like Indo-Malay. So, for example, money, white, and so on. These terms, these words, in the Aboriginal language, have the same, are close or very, very close, or the same that are used in Indo-Malaysian languages. The Muslims also plant tamarind trees and respected the indigenous population in Australia, as we mentioned before. And the Aboriginal again had respect for the Muslims. As we said, this pushed them towards looking into Islam, and in the end, many of the Aborigines also accepted Islam. As also I mentioned before, many Muslim Indonesians married Aboriginal women, had families in the Northern Territories, and created whole villages. The Aborigines who accepted Islam, some of them followed the Indonesian traders back to Indonesia, or went to the Indonesian archipelagos to countries such as the Philippines nowadays. A very important point, very, very interesting point also. If you look at the complexion of people in the Philippines, especially in the south, the Mindanao province, where darker Filipinos live, you see that there could be a connection. This is a hypothesis, but there could be a connection with Muslim Aboriginals who actually followed the Indonesians back to Indonesia and to the Philippines and to Asia, and settled even there. So you see that there could be a connection, mashallah, a very interesting one, which in the end a more peaceful and definitely more positive relationship between Muslims and Australia. Now we're coming to the point to look at the British. What did they do when they arrived in Australia? Yeah, they claimed the country for themselves, of course, right? And suddenly it was their discovery, and it was something that was part of the British Empire. It became a colony for prisoners. And we should not forget the discriminatory policy towards Aborigines in Australia, where they would actually have to, the British would take the children, Aboriginal children, away, especially the lighter ones, and would put them in Christian families to raise them according to their understanding, and get them away from their parents, and would forcefully actually divorce families. The next point of Islam coming to Australia after the British were there, now the first time, was actually in the 19th century. In 1840, the first camels were imported into the country, and 20 years later, in June, the first camel drivers arrived in Melbourne, in Victoria. So the Australians saw that the territory of Australia, or the people living in Australia, saw that the territory of Australia is close to, is a desert. So they decided to basically get laborers to come and work for them, because I think that's what the Europeans do best. So what did they do? They got themselves basically some Afghan cameleers, as they called them. Afghan cameleers from not only Afghanistan, but again, that time there was no clear definition of the country of Afghanistan, but from Asia, Afghan cameleers, most of them Muslims. They would come over with camels, and they would then be put to work in Australia. Now, interestingly enough, these were the people also who put the railway for Australia, and nowadays there is a reminder of these Asian immigrants. It's named the GAN, short for Afghan. This is the railway starting in Adelaide in the south and ending in Darwin in the Northern Territory, which is the territory where Muslims used to live actually. So this railway is called the GAN because of Afghan, obviously. Due to racism and increasing difficulties to stay in Australia, many of them returned to their home countries. Another Muslim group who were recruited in the 1870s, several decades later, were the Muslim Malay pearl divers. The Australians signed an agreement with the Dutch, who had colonized Southeast Asia, to import Malay to Western Australia and Northern Territory pearling grounds, but again, most didn't stay long and returned home soon. The first Muslim Albanians came in the 1920s and 30s to Australia and managed to build the first mosque in Shepparton in Victoria in 1960 and in Melbourne in 1963. So there we go. In the 20th century, that was not the first mosque ever established, because the Afghan cameleers had already established a small mosque, which still exists, by the way, can be visited. But it was the first modern mosque that was established in Australia. And it really put Islam firmly into Australian society now. Muslims who came from the Balkan Peninsula mainly, so Albanians, Bosnians, Turks, they, Kosovo and so on, they came mainly between in the 60s and the 70s, and settled in Australia under the agreement between both countries, okay, between Turkey, for example, and Australia, between Bosnia and Australia, Yugoslavia at that time, obviously Yugoslavia and Australia, so countries such as Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania and Turkey. They established, of course, mosques and associations, but they were just the start of the modern migration. Other Muslims came also from other countries such as the Middle East, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Fiji Islands, Sudan, Egypt, Palestine, and the Indian subcontinent, etc., etc. Important to mention is that Islam in Australia, their economy is dependent on the halal meat export. Australia exports a massive amount of halal meat to the Muslim world. Okay, so Southeast Asia and the Middle East, they import a lot of meat from Australia, and this of course will have an impact. I mean, if Islamophobia becomes more and bigger in Australia, this will of course will have an impact on the relationship between the Middle East and the economy actually of the Middle East and the economy of Australia, definitely, no doubt about it. With regards to New Zealand, just to come to this point again, Muslim Chinese gold diggers were the ones who actually were the first ones to arrive as Muslims in New Zealand. They were Chinese gold diggers, as we said, in the 19th century already. So this is a very weird contact, actually something that is unknown in other parts of the world. They came from China, they were gold diggers, they came for that reason to New Zealand, but they were also followed by other Muslims from India and Eastern Europe between 1900 and 1960s. So the same like in Australia, we have people coming from the Balkan Peninsula, but also from India, and they established, of course, Islamic organizations all over the country, and accepted and were accepted actually in New Zealand. as equal citizens, mashallah. Definitely, it seems to be working better in New Zealand than in Australia. Other Muslims who came in the more recent time, in the 1970s and 80s, Muslims from the Fiji Islands. The Fiji Islands have a big Muslim population who came as laborers under the British government and colonial rule from India. Okay, most of them originally from India. But again, we've come to an end, and we have seen that the Islam in the world is massive. There is no black and white issue. It didn't go to all the places the same way. But we have seen, I think, one pattern. We have seen that Islam was definitely not taken because of battles and by the sword to the world, but it mainly ended up in the rest of the world because of trade. That was number one reason, and because of conversions, and because of many people seeing the Muslim character and the Muslim understanding of Islam, the proper understanding of Islam, mashallah. So Jazakumullah khair, we've come to an end, and I hope you enjoyed this journey through our history, this journey through the globe. I mean, I enjoyed it massively, and I hope that we will see each other again, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you soon again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.